In the dark periods of the 1900s, when deaf culture was harassed and American Sign Language, or ASL, was declined as a language, William Stokoe published a book proving American Sign Language as a genuine language. Deaf people were mistreated and had several conflicts with the hearing population who wanted to obligate them to be oral. William Stokoe was hired to try to get deaf people to learn to be oral and forget about signing, but luckily he was amazed at ASL. He researched American Sign Language extensively with students at Gallaudet University and published a dissertation that helped to change people's perspectives on deaf culture. Immediately after this, the dark periods for the deaf population were finally over. Sign language is now considered a language and deaf people are now respected and treated fairly. In the early 1800s and most of the 1900s, deaf people were not treated fairly but instead unequally. Alexander Graham Bell, one of the biggest oralists, advised deaf people not to get married or have children because if they did, deafness would continue to be a problem. Bell stated that this tendency of deaf people marrying deaf people would eventually lead to a deaf race and would be a great calamity to the world. Bell continued to support oralism until his death in 1922. The International Congress on the Education of the Deaf met in Milan, Italy in 1880, named the Milan Conference to discuss the learning for the deaf. The controversial argument was to consider if deaf people should learn to be oral or not. The supporters of the oralism method won the vote, and of course Congress declared that the oral method should be preferred to that of signs in the education and instruction of deaf mutes. Since the 1880s, when a movement against signing began at the International Conference in Milan, schools for the deaf had insisted that their students communicate orally. Students were taught to produce understandable sounds. If students were found signing, they would receive harsh punishments, including physical abuse. Deaf students were tied up to chairs to prevent them from signing, which obligated them to use the voice they did not have to converse. For the next 10 years, sign language was declined in deaf education. The only two schools in the United States that allowed deaf students to attend were both oral and did not allow them to learn in their proper language. Finding jobs or even getting the opportunity for an interview was a difficult situation for all the deaf as they had little to no job opportunities. They were also not allowed to join the military. Hearing people did not think deaf people were capable of working and thought they lacked communication. Apart from not having any job opportunities and being punished for using sign language, they were also not permitted to buy property because laws labeled them as non-persons and were seen as being unable to learn or be educated at all. Many deaf people were forced to have guardians to prevent arguments and problems with the hearing population. Many deaf people fell into depression since they were not allowed to sign, and it was impossible for them to communicate with someone who has no knowledge of ASL. In 345 to 550 AD, St. Augustine, a Christian priest, believed that deaf children were a sign of God's anger at the sins of their parents. Hearing people saw deafness as a huge issue and were finding ways to solve it, even if it meant unfairness towards deaf people. They strongly believed deaf people must learn spoken language to fully function in the hearing society. Deaf people were seen as ruiners of society for being different and for not being able to communicate properly using their voices. But for the deaf, being born without the hearing sense was no problem at all. Hearing people invented SEE or Signed Exact English. Deaf people despised the SEE program as it was invented by people who had no clue about ASL and it wasn't a real language. SEE helped deaf people learn English and how to write it, but it did not help them learn what it was or really understand the word, and deaf people are all about visuals. SEE changed most of the ASL signs so that the first letter of the sign matched the first letter of the word. They also fixed the signs to be an exact representation of the English vocabulary and grammar. This provoked huge disagreements amongst deaf people because it was extremely dissimilar. Sadly, many deaf people were forced to learn Sign Exact English. 90% of the deaf have hearing parents, and their only easy way to communicate was through the SEE system, as they had little to no experience about American Sign Language. As I mentioned earlier, William Stokoe arrived at Gallaudet University in 1955 to educate deaf students on how to be oral. In his time at Gallaudet, his interest in ASL linguistics grew. He was astonished at sign language and knew exactly how to prove that ASL was an authentic language used by deaf people to express themselves and communicate properly. William Stokoe was not deaf and had no prior interactions with deaf people before coming to Gallaudet University. William Stokoe understood that nothing was going to prevent deaf people to communicate using their own language, and they would find a way to teach the whole deaf population, no matter if it was permitted or not. Stokoe met with his students at Gallaudet to help him understand the principles of ASL. Stokoe studied ASL and discovered that it contained linguistic features like syntax, phonology, morphology, etc., like any other language. William Stokoe's huge dedication and effort led him to gather information about the deaf and their language. Thanks to the fabulous information he found, he decided to write a book that later inspired many. The book was A Dictionary of American Sign Language on Linguistic Principles. Stokoe said, "It has everything a language has. It has vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. It is a language which defies a community, and it is worthy of respect just like any other language." All of his co-workers thought Stokoe had gone crazy and was just wasting much of his time. "They told me my job was to teach them English," recalled Stokoe. "Even some of the deaf people on the faculty thought I was out of my skull. All the experts were saying, sign language can be ignored, it is not a real language." William Stokoe's research on ASL revolutionized the understanding of ASL around the world, and it had a profound impact on deaf culture, deaf education, and sign language teaching and interpreting. This topic relates to the conflict and compromise because the oralists wanted the teaching method for the deaf to be fully oral. They believed that that was the only way for a deaf person to fully function in a hearing society. The other method was ASL. The manuals believed that the best way for a deaf person to communicate was by using sign language since they could not hear. Since American Sign Language was not considered a true language, the oralism method won, and deaf people were seen as non-persons. William Stokoe stepped in to help the deaf. He wrote a book that made people around the world change their perspectives about ASL and proved American Sign Language includes everything a language has.
William Stokoe had a huge impact on ASL and the deaf community. He was considered a hero for the deaf society as he decided and dedicated his time to help and keep their language existing. Jill, a former host of Deaf Mosaic, commented, "Bill Stokoe is the father of linguistics in the field of American Sign Language. If it weren't for him, we would still be in the dark ages." He changed the minds of his co-workers who had no faith in their language and were prepared to give it up for spoken language. ASL is now considered a genuine language and deaf people are respected. William Stokoe touches the hearts of millions of people in America.